The quiet neighborhood had never experienced anything unusual until that one horrifying night that changed everything forever. The Prasad family's home, which once echoed with laughter and the aroma of home, cooked meals, stood eerily silent, its walls about to witness a tragedy too gruesome to imagine. Inside, the killer, someone who shared blood with the victims, moved like a shadow, every step deliberate, every breath steady. It was late at night, and the family slept peacefully, unaware of the horror creeping into their rooms. The killer had planned this moment with precision, rehearsing it in his mind again and again until it became second nature. He entered the first bedroom quietly, his hands shaking not from fear but from anticipation. With a sudden burst of violence, he struck, silencing his first victim before they even had a chance to scream. Blood splattered against the sheets, and the warm, safe room instantly turned into a scene of chaos. Without hesitation, he moved to the next room where two younger family members lay asleep, blissfully unaware. Their dreams ended in seconds as he unleashed his brutality, stabbing relentlessly, driven by a mix of rage and cold calculation. The sound of muffled cries filled the air for a moment, but soon even those were gone, replaced by the sickening silence of death. The killer showed no remorse, no second thoughts, only a chilling determination to erase every living soul in that house. As he advanced through the home, the screams grew weaker and fewer until none were left. Furniture was overturned, glass shattered, and walls stained with blood as the massacre unfolded. What once was a sanctuary of love became a slaughterhouse. Neighbors, who later confessed to hearing faint noises, dismissed them as arguments or the sound of a television. Nobody realized that an entire family was being wiped out in those very moments. By the time the house fell into complete silence, the killer stood in the middle of the carnage, his chest heaving, but his eyes cold and unfeeling. Bodies lay lifeless around him. Parents, children, elders, each one silenced by the hand of someone they trusted. He looked around at the destruction he had caused, not with regret, but with a twisted sense of satisfaction, as though eliminating them had somehow set him free from his own demons. Outside, the world carried on, unaware of the nightmare that had just unfolded inside those four walls. The streetlights flickered softly, the air was calm, and crickets chirped, as though mocking the horror that no one yet knew about. The Prasad family's American dream ended that night, not by the hands of strangers, but by betrayal from within, and their home was now nothing more than a graveyard holding secrets that would soon shock the entire nation. When the sun rose the next morning, the neighborhood appeared ordinary, yet inside the Prasad home, an unthinkable silence lingered over the blood-soaked rooms. Relatives who had been trying to reach the family grew anxious when their calls went unanswered. Hours passed, and worry turned into panic. A cousin, unable to shake the growing dread, drove to the house and knocked frantically on the door. No one responded. The curtains remained drawn, and the stillness felt unnatural. Summoning the courage to enter, he stepped inside, only to be greeted by a suffocating odor that made his stomach churn. His eyes widened in horror as he stumbled forward and saw the first body. Shock rooted him in place. The sight was beyond comprehension. The walls, once decorated with family photos and reminders of happier days, were now smeared with streaks of dried blood. Trembling, he backed away, his screams piercing through the morning calm as he fled outside to call the police. Within minutes, patrol cars and emergency vehicles arrived, sirens cutting through the air. Officers entered cautiously, their hands on their weapons, though they knew the threat had already passed. What awaited them inside was a scene so brutal that even seasoned detectives struggled to keep their composure. Bodies lay scattered across the home, each victim brutally murdered. Blood pooled beneath them, dried on furniture, and splattered across walls. The sheer savagery of the crime stunned everyone present. One officer had to step back outside, gasping for air, while another whispered, "I've never seen anything like this in my career." The house felt heavy, as if the violence had soaked into the very walls. Detectives began piecing together the timeline, noting the forced precision with which the killer had moved through the home. Nothing was stolen. Valuables, cash and jewelry were left untouched, This wasn't a burglary gone wrong, it was something far more personal. The brutality, the methodical nature of the killings, and the complete eradication of the family pointed to a killer with deep resentment, someone who wanted not just to harm, but to erase the Prasads completely. As officers canvassed the neighborhood, neighbors recounted hearing faint noises, what they thought were arguments or television sounds. But no one suspected such carnage was taking place just a few feet away. Back at the scene, investigators noted something chilling. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever committed the massacre was someone the family trusted enough to let inside. Suspicion immediately began to form, and attention turned toward the surviving relative who, strangely, seemed distant and emotionless upon hearing of the massacre. While relatives wept and collapsed in grief, he stood unnervingly calm, answering questions with rehearsed politeness, but without visible sorrow. His behavior raised red flags, and detectives quietly began to probe deeper. The coroner worked through the day, carefully examining each victim. The youngest had been asleep, killed without ever opening their eyes. The elders had wounds suggesting they tried to resist, but were overpowered quickly. Each detail added weight to the unbearable truth. The massacre was intentional, precise, and deeply personal. As investigators walked through the rooms, their boots leaving impressions in dried blood, one detective muttered under his breath, "This wasn't rage alone. This was planned." And with that, the path of suspicion began to narrow, leading closer to the one man whose mask of composure would soon crack under the weight of his own cruelty. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense as detectives prepared to question the only surviving relative who seemed to be connected to the massacre. He sat across the table in a dimly lit interrogation room, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. For someone whose entire family had been wiped out in a single night, his demeanor was unnervingly calm. No tears, no outbursts, not even a flicker of genuine grief crossed his face. Detectives exchanged wary glances, already sensing that this man wasn't the devastated family member he pretended to be. The questioning began gently. Investigators asked him where he was on the night of the murders, and he replied smoothly, as if the answers had been rehearsed. He claimed he had been out of town for a short trip, staying with a friend, but when officers followed up on that alibi, inconsistencies quickly emerged. The friend couldn't confirm his presence for the entire night. The timeline didn't add up. Even worse, security cameras near the Prasad residence showed a figure resembling him entering the neighborhood hours before the killings. Detectives pressed harder, their voices growing firmer, their questions sharper. At first, he deflected with half smiles and careful words, but as the hours dragged on, the cracks in his story began to show. He contradicted himself, forgetting details he had previously sworn were true. When officers confronted him with physical evidence, a blood-stained piece of clothing found in his car, his composure faltered for the first time. His jaw clenched, his eyes flickered with anger, and for a moment, his calm mask slipped to reveal the darkness underneath. The turning point came when investigators presented DNA analysis. The blood on his clothes matched one of the victims, and his fingerprints were found in unusual places within the home, on objects that had been moved during the massacre. Confronted with irrefutable evidence, he leaned back in his chair, silent, his cold eyes fixed on the detectives. After a long pause, he whispered chillingly, "They deserved it." Those words sent a shiver through the room. It wasn't an admission of guilt in the traditional sense, but it was enough to expose the hatred that had driven him. He eventually revealed glimpses of his motive during the interrogation. Bitterness and envy had festered inside him for years. He resented the Prasad family's success, their reputation in the community, their unity, and their achievements, while he struggled with failures and rejection. Instead of working to improve his own life, he chose to destroy theirs. In his twisted mind, eliminating them meant erasing the reminder of his shortcomings. Detectives listened in disbelief, their pens still, their faces grim. It was not just a crime of greed. It was a massacre born from jealousy and deep-seated resentment. Meanwhile, news of the interrogation spread quickly. The community, already reeling from the tragedy, was horrified to learn that the killer wasn't a stranger, but one of their own, bound by blood to the victims. Vigils were held outside the Prasad home, candles flickering in the night as neighbors mourned and prayed. Parents clutched their children tighter, shaken by the thought that evil could lurk so close, hidden beneath a familiar face. Back in the interrogation room, detectives grew more convinced that they weren't just speaking to a grieving relative. They were face to face with a cold-blooded murderer. His lack of remorse, his chilling words, and the overwhelming evidence painted a portrait of a man who had crossed every boundary of humanity. With that, the case against him solidified, and the path toward justice began. The next step would be the courtroom, where his fate would be decided, and where the Prasad family's cries for justice would finally be heard. The courtroom was filled to the brim on the day the trial began. Reporters jostling for space, relatives sitting silently with grief carved into their faces, and curious onlookers waiting to witness what would soon become one of the most infamous trials in American history. The accused sat at the defense table, his expression as cold and detached as it had been in the interrogation room. Dressed neatly in a suit, he looked more like a businessman than a man accused of butchering his entire family. Yet the weight of evidence against him was undeniable. As the judge called the court to order, a hush fell across the room, the kind of silence that felt heavy with anticipation. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the gruesome details. They spoke of the massacre, of how every member of the Prasad family was slain methodically, as though part of a dark ritual. Graphic images of the crime scene were displayed to the jury, some of whom visibly flinched at the sight. The prosecutor's voice trembled with anger as he pointed toward the accused, describing him as a man who let envy and hatred consume him until he slaughtered those who had once embraced him as kin. Witnesses were called, neighbors, relatives, forensic experts, all piecing together the chilling puzzle. One expert described the sheer brutality of the wounds, noting that they reflected not only a desire to kill, but a desire to erase, to annihilate. The defense, on the other hand, tried desperately to paint the accused as mentally unstable, a man suffering from hidden psychological disorders that clouded his judgment. They argued he was not in control of his actions that night, that his mind had betrayed him. But their argument faltered against the mountain of evidence. The jury listened to recordings of his interrogation, where he coldly admitted they deserved it. Those 3 words hung in the air like a curse, stripping away any sympathy the defense tried to muster. As the days turned into weeks, the trial became a national headline. The American community was torn. Some couldn't believe one of their own could commit such a monstrous act, while others demanded the harshest punishment, arguing that the scale of the crime warranted nothing less. Emotions ran high inside the courtroom. Family friends sobbed uncontrollably as testimonies described the innocence of the children lost that night. One detective broke down on the stand as he recalled the scene, his voice cracking as he admitted it was the worst crime scene he had ever witnessed. Finally, after weeks of testimony, the jury retreated to deliberate. Hours stretched into what felt like an eternity for those waiting. And then, at last, they returned. The foreman stood, his hands trembling slightly, as he delivered the verdict guilty on all counts of murder. A gasp swept through the room, though few were surprised. All eyes then turned to the judge, who now bore the responsibility of determining the punishment. In a voice that carried both authority and sorrow, the judge declared that the brutality of the crime left no room for leniency. The accused would face the ultimate punishment, the death sentence. Gasps, sobs, and murmurs filled the courtroom. For the first time in American history, an Indian immigrant had been sentenced to die for his crimes. The killer sat motionless, his face void of emotion, as though the weight of the sentence barely touched him. But for the victims' families, there was a glimmer of relief. Justice, though painful, had been served. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters delivered breaking news, and protesters gathered, some arguing against the death penalty, others demanding swift execution. Yet amid the noise, one truth stood unshaken. The Prasad family's story had ended in tragedy. and the man responsible would never walk free again. The years that followed the verdict carried with them a weight that no sentence could fully lift. The Prasad home, once a place of warmth and family gatherings, remained haunted in the eyes of the community. Neighbors passed by with lowered gazes, unable to forget the memories of that dreadful night. Some avoided the street altogether, unable to bear the thought of what had happened inside those walls. Eventually, the house was sold, but its new owners soon discovered that a home cannot so easily shed its past. The faint smell of paint could not erase the stains of history, nor could fresh furniture mask the echoes of screams that seemed to linger in the air. For the relatives of the Prasads, grief became a permanent companion. They gathered each year to honor the lives lost, lighting candles and praying for souls who had come to America in search of a brighter future, only to meet an end so brutal it shook two nations. Photographs of smiling faces, children who would never grow old, parents who would never see their dreams fulfilled, were displayed at vigils, a stark reminder of lives stolen by betrayal. Each vigil drew crowds of mourners, not only from the Indian, American community but also from neighbors, classmates, and colleagues who remembered the family for their kindness and generosity. Meanwhile, the killer sat on death row, confined to a small cell, awaiting the final reckoning promised by the court. For him, days blended into nights, but his presence remained a dark shadow in the public consciousness. He was not forgotten. His name became synonymous with cruelty and betrayal. Some questioned whether the death sentence was truly justice or merely vengeance. But for most, the punishment felt like the only measure that could ever come close to fitting the crime. Still, nothing could erase the horror of that night. Nothing could bring back the lives that were lost. The massacre left scars far beyond the immediate family. Parents in the community held their children closer, haunted by the reminder that evil often hides in familiar faces. Friendships grew strained as suspicion crept into the minds of those who once trusted without hesitation. The tragedy had stripped away a sense of innocence, leaving behind a wound that healed slowly, if at all. Even years later, when people spoke of the case, their voices lowered as though the very mention of it carried a curse. Yet amid the sorrow, a lesson emerged. The Prasad family became a symbol of resilience in memory, their lives celebrated not for how they ended, but for how they were lived. Schools held cultural events in their honor, scholarship funds were created in their names, and their story was told as a cautionary tale about envy, resentment, and the hidden darkness within human nature. Their legacy, though tragic, served as a reminder that communities must stand together against hatred and violence. As the years rolled on, the case continued to appear in documentaries, news articles, and true crime discussions. It remained infamous not only because of its brutality, but also because it marked a grim milestone in history. The first time an Indian immigrant was sentenced to death in the United States. That fact alone etched the Prasad massacre into the annals of true crime, a case scholars, journalists, and criminologists studied for its psychological and cultural implications. Even now, whenever people recount the tragedy, the same questions resurface. How could a man turn so violently against his own blood? What darkness festers in the human heart that it can extinguish love so completely? No answers can ever fully satisfy those left behind. The truth is as haunting as the crime itself. Sometimes evil wears the face of family, and sometimes betrayal comes from the people we least expect. And so, as this story closes, we remember the Prasads not for their deaths, but for their lives, their dreams, their laughter, and their hopes that once filled a home now forever silent. If you found this story as chilling and heartbreaking as I did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to The Twisted Minds, where we uncover more true crime cases that reveal the darkest sides of humanity. Because only by remembering the victims can we ensure that their stories live on, even when their voices have been silenced.